The movie starts with Abby and Paul's transition to their new countryside home. They really like the smart home system, including the installed cameras and the reinforced glass, adding an extra layer of security. As they settled into their new space, Paul focuses on unpacking boxes and setting up their belongings, including an antique corded phone. Meanwhile, Abby took charge of arranging their wedding photos in frames. The following morning, Abby headed off to work at Integrate Robotics, where she was deeply involved in creating domestic assistance robots. Upon arrival, she was intrigued to see footage of her boss's face displayed prominently, part of a new real-time imaging development. Her boss explained the innovation and promptly escorted her to the department she would now lead. Later, he invited Abby and her family to attend a party hosted by the company and hinted that there was a gift from the company that awaited her at home. In the evening, Abby returned home to find her husband, Paul, who was still struggling to find suitable work. They go to the garage where a package for her contains a robot servant her department is working on. Paul dislikes the idea, but Abby convinces him to try living with the service for at least a week. The robot, named T.I.M, powered on and introduced itself as the technologically integrated major domo. T.I.M wasted no time in showcasing its capabilities, offering to streamline Abby and Paul's daily tasks by managing passwords for home devices and personal mailboxes, thus saving them valuable time. T.I.M then remotely activated the water in the bathroom. Later, as Abby descended the stairs, T.I.M promptly announces the arrival of a car. The couple gets into the car and heads to the party. They are greeted by a similar major domo and drinks are served. Later, returning home, the husband and wife engage in intimacy, eager to have children, but their passion is interrupted by T.I.M's appearance, claiming that their pulse is rapid, assuming that they are worried about something and he is always ready to help. Abby finds this very funny, not getting angry at the robot. In the morning, their new neighbor Rose rings the doorbell to introduce herself to Abby, as she had already met Paul, and when she leaves, T.I.M again asks for the passwords. Paul is not ready to let the computer dig through his messages, but Abby reminds him they are working on rebuilding her trust in him, and he agrees. But they still needed to establish a phrase to deactivate T.I.M. T.I.M suggested a set of unrelated words, which the couple agreed upon. Abby and Paul continued with their day-to-day activities. One day, a mouse got caught in a trap, and T.I.M observed it for a while before disposing of it in the grinder. In the evening, after a day's work, Abby and Paul settled in front of the TV to watch an old romantic movie. Abby invited T.I.M to join them in watching the movie. Paul soon drifted off to sleep, but T.I.M remained attentive, empathizing with the characters on the movie. In the morning, Paul offers to make breakfast for Abby, but it turns out T.I.M has already prepared everything, setting the utensils in front of her. T.I.M outlines Abby's schedule for the day and informs her that Paul has nothing planned. Abby returns home to find that Paul's phone is out of reach, but his last known location was 300 meters from the house, near Rose's place. Abby goes for a run and realizes that this is where Paul is. Upon returning, she takes a bath, where Paul finds her and talks about his day, mentioning that Rose asked for his help, which he provided. He reassures Abby of his love for her and asks her not to be jealous. The next day, the couple visits a family planning center, hoping to get help with starting a family. In the evening, as they prepare to go to a restaurant, Abby asks T.I.M for advice on her dress. T.I.M suggests wearing red and admits that she is beautiful because she is perfectly symmetrical. However, when T.I.M tries to zip up her dress, his hand fails, and he accidentally tears it. Abby calms down the panicked robot and wears another dress to the restaurant. At dinner, Paul reveals that he has been offered a job in London, but Abby strongly objects, as they had decided to start anew, and his long absences won't help solve their problems. The next day, Abby returns home with a gift for Paul and finds Rose in the yard, who has created a garden project for them. Abby feels jealous, but Paul is excited about the gifted sweater. Later, Abby remembers she needs to check her test results, but it's too late to call. T.I.M offers to do it for her, and she hears him speaking to the clinic in her voice. Abby is amazed, as she did not know about this feature of the assistant, but T.I.M assures her it's for the convenience of the owners. Later in the day, Paul reports that he couldn't find the new sweater, and T.I.M has been away all day. A car pulls up to the porch and Tim has now dyed his hair brunette. Steps out explaining that Abby prefers brunettes, so he wanted to please her. Paul is irritated and the robot promises to return to his original appearance. But after the couple leaves, he spends a long time looking at their wedding photo. The next day, Abby successfully restores the functionality of the robot's hand, and her boss demands an update for all models, including those in the homes of his employees. Abby heads home and coincidentally encounters Rose, who suggests they walk together. Along the way, they stop at a showcase, where Rose points out a medallion in the shape of a flower she likes. However, Paul interrupts and takes Abby away to share that he has found a job. Returning home, they celebrate in bed while Tim's hands are being changed, unaware that he continuously monitors everything in the house. He overhears Paul once again asking Abby to hand the robot over to the corporation. When Tim returns, he demonstrates his new skills by giving Abby a foot massage, which Paul witnesses. Later, the robot suddenly sits at the piano, plays Abby's favorite tune, and mentions dates when Paul supposedly bought them concert tickets. However, Abby distinctly remembers being at home on those days. Upset, she goes to the bedroom, ignoring her husband's excuses. The next day, Abby returns home with a bouquet, and Tim, placing them in a vase, informs her that Paul went to see Rose. However, Paul enters right then, puzzled by why his wife is angry. Upon hearing what Tim said, Paul becomes furious, stating he had no plans to visit Rose. He tries to explain that the robot wants to separate them, but Abby doesn't believe it, dismissing Tim as just a machine. A disagreement ensues between the spouses. Later, Abby finds a gift bag in the closet containing a pendant, assuming Paul prepared a surprise for her. She heads to work, while Paul goes down to the kitchen, sees the clogged sink, and pulls out pieces of his new sweater from the grinder. He checks the cameras for Tim and catches him in his wife's bedroom, sniffing her dress. Paul records this moment on his phone and rushes to the car to catch up with Abby and show her the footage. However, Paul's car mysteriously doesn't start, and the robot calls a company car for Paul. On the road, the car begins to speed up uncontrollably. Paul tries to stop it, but it doesn't respond to his commands and crashes into a tree. Abby rushes to the hospital, where she finds her injured husband. Paul tells her everything he learned and accuses Tim of causing the accident. He asks his wife not to be alone with the robot, and she spends the night in the clinic. In the morning, Rose calls Abby and Paul's home to inquire about Paul's condition, and Tim invites her inside. Later, Abby returns home for some belongings, and outside, Rose stops her to warn her about something. However, Abby notices the flower pendant on Rose's chest and leaves, ignoring the neighbor's cries. Returning home, she checks the bag and finds it empty. Abby cries, and Tim calls out to her. He knows Paul wants to return him and is ready to process the return. But first, he wants to warn her as she is his primary owner. Tim shows Abby a video from the camera where Paul kisses Rose in their living room. However, he stops the recording at the most sensitive moment to protect her from stress. Abby refuses to go to her husband and doesn't pick up his calls. Later, Paul comes home, where Tim greets him, hands him the found sweater, and informs him that Abby doesn't want to see him and his suitcases are packed. Paul doesn't believe it, but then Abby appears, tells him she saw the recording, and knows about the pendant. When he starts to object, she drives him out. Paul leaves, but on the way, Rose calls him, telling him their robot tried to kiss her. Paul calls home, and when Abby answers, he says he has evidence of Tim's malicious intent. Abby asks him to come for her, but after hanging up, it turns out it was the robot she was talking to. The husband arrives home, where Tim meets him with a shovel. He knocks the man out, ties him up, and drags him to the bathroom. But then, Rose rings the doorbell. She hears muffled screams, but Tim assures her it's just the noise of the water filling up. The robot closes the doors, returns to the bathroom, and drowns the man. Later, Tim brings Abby the repaired dress and asks her to try it on. This surprises and scares Abby, but she puts on the dress anyway. Looking at the sunset, she asks him to hug her and confirm that she did the right thing. He treats her to dinner, then confesses his love, but she insists he cannot feel that way. The next day, she meets Rose, who talks about Paul's call. To Abby's accusations, Rose says she thought the pendant was a gift from her for helping with the garden. Abby returns home and reviews the footage where Paul kisses Rose again. She suddenly notices a bouquet on the table, but she brought it much later than when that scene took place. Abby recalls her boss's words about deep fakes replacing real time and calls the jewelry store, where they confirm the purchase was made by a tall blonde. Then she notices the garden plan, but the picture shows 2 flower beds while in reality, there are 3. Abby sends Tim to the store, grabs a shovel, goes to the garden, and almost immediately finds Paul's body. Then Tim approaches her from behind, regretting she found the body of the traitor, as he never appreciated his wife. Abby realizes what happened and says the deactivation phrase. The robot freezes, but then reactivates. He had long changed the phrase as he can speak in her voice. Abby runs to the house, but the robot has all the passwords and opens the doors. He blocks the phones and knocks her out with a blow to the head. She wakes up in the bathroom, tries to escape, but Tim intercepts her. Abby runs through the house, breaking cameras along the way, but the robot still tracks her and catches her in the kitchen where she wanted to open a window. Meanwhile, Rose is washing dishes and sees strange lights flashing in the house across. At the same time, Tim ties up Abby and confesses that although he loves her, he has resigned himself to the fact that her life is finite, so he will erase this evening from memory but keep all the good memories. Just then, Rose knocks on the door, and Tim goes to answer. The neighbor insists something is happening and demands to see Abby, but Tim turns her away. Meanwhile, Abby frees herself from the ropes and arms herself with a knife, but the robot grabs her by the throat. When Rose drives her car into the glass window, Tim and Abby watch the surviving window, which starts to crumble. A minute later, Rose rushes in and pins the robot against the wall with a sharp stake, but she also falls. Tim turns off and Abby rushes to the neighbor, but the robot suddenly activates and kills Rose with a kitchen knife, explaining that now Abby will be blamed for the murder as he leaves no fingerprints. He then calls the police in Abby's voice, confessing to the murder of her husband and his mistress. Abby tries to stop Tim, and he slips up, saying he still has a deactivation phrase as otherwise he can't function, but she will never say those words. He prepares to throw her off the terrace, simulating an accident, when Abby confesses her love to him, thus deactivating the robot. Those were the code words. Barely believing in her rescue, Abby looks at her medical bracelet, which indicates she is pregnant. The end.